how does one become despirited in the first place? There is a universal experience of this 3D reality that we all have. We experience what we call pleasure, and we experience what we call pain. And generally speaking, pleasure is an object of our craving, and pain is an object of our aversion or avoidance. In other words, what we want and what we don't want. That's pretty straightforward. And we can all relate to this. But when we consider what pleasure and pain are, and we observe ourselves, we cannot deny the nature of the experience. And the nature of pleasure and pain, what we want and don't want, comes down to a form of stimulation. And you can observe this when you observe yourself experiencing pleasure or experiencing pain. Either way, you are dealing with a kind of stimulation. And it's a stimulation of the three brains: the mental center, emotional center, and the motor, instinctive, sexual centers. These are the three brains of the human machine. Whether it's pleasure or pain, one or more of these centers are being stimulated in our nervous system. And we have two types of our nervous system. Our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems can be stimulated. The sympathetic nervous system, which puts us into the fight or flight mode, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which puts us into that more relaxed mode, that calm and rest and sleep mode. And these are, generally speaking, how the nervous system is understood in these two states. So generally speaking, the stimulation happens in the sympathetic nervous system, but not always, but much of the time. And there's actually more than just fight or flight. There's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and all relate, generally speaking, to stimulation by way of fear. But if you observe yourself under, for example, the effects of stimulants, if you drink enough coffee, for instance, if you ingest enough caffeine specifically, you can feel the jitters. You will trigger the stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and it will be as though you are in a heightened state of fear, a heightened state of anxiety. Even if you are at present not experience that emotion, you might not be afraid, neither mentally, emotionally, or in any instinctive sense. You will not be under the influence of fear, and yet your body will be stimulated into a simulated state of fear. This is a very interesting relationship between these two words, stimulated and simulated, or stimulation and simulation. All manner of stress, all manner of excitement can trigger the heightened state of the nervous system, where the nervous system is in activity. It is, again, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Now, this humanity has invented all manner of entertainments, all manner of stimulations, and we even have invented simulations. We call them video games that stimulate both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, that essentially put you to sleep, and you're just going through the motions mechanically, automatically, like a robot. But you're doing that because of the way the mental and the motor instinctive sexual centers are being stimulated. And it is a simulation of sorts, because it is simulating what drives animals to behave in certain ways that is required for their survival. So these simulated experiences that we call video games or slot machines are simulating that, and they're stimulating that, with the relationship between stimulation and simulation. And the difference between the two of them is a T. Now, we drew that T in its lowercase form precisely because a T also happens to be a cross. And a cross, as you know, cross or an X, doesn't matter. The cross, as you know, is a symbol for the law of three. It's masculine, feminine, and the union of masculine and feminine. So the masculine vertical phallus, the feminine horizontal uterus, and the union of masculine and feminine, the cross. This is the law of three. This is the law of sex. This is the creative law of the universe. This is how the universe creates. So it follows, if we want to just carry on with the logic here, that if you start with a simulation, to stimulate, to cause a stimulation, to go from a simulation to stimulation requires the application of the sexual force, which comes into activity when masculine and feminine unite. That's the T that you add to a simulation to create stimulation. Pleasure or pain, in other words, is created when a simulation is charged with the energy, with the creative force, with the sexual energy. And then the experience of pleasure or pain is had within one or more of the centers of the human machine. But the obvious question is this word. At the beginning, we said we took for granted that this 3D reality is real. But what if it's not? What if it's just a simulation? And our share of the creative force, that we have free will to choose how it flows, up and atom or down and out, which we have talked about in the past weeks. That is the creative force. What if what we call reality is created moment to moment in terms of how that sexual force is applied? But if that sexual force is being applied to create pleasure or pain, in other words, stimulation, that keeps us identified in the simulation, which we then call real, because we identify with the pleasure or the pain. We identify with the craving or the aversion. We identify with what we want and what we don't want. And that we have explained very often, but you know from your own experience that these statements, want and don't want, they don't appear to us in such a innocuous form. They come to us like this: I want and I don't want. It is the I that experiences pleasure or pain and identifies with the pleasure or pain. And it is the I that obsesses over the past pleasure and pain, or fantasizes about future pleasure or pain, the potential for pleasure or pain. But what is that I? We've often explained that there is no singular I, that there are many I's. We call them egos. And they're, fear, lust, anger, greed, pride, laziness, etc. And they play this game of King of the Hill in our consciousness, this Game of Thrones, where they're jockeying for their place on the Iron Throne. And they do that by presenting themselves as I and getting us identified with whatever it is they want or don't want, hypnotizing us, convincing us that that's what we want, that they are who we are. But all they are these programs, these algorithms, these mechanical entities, mechanical phenomena that just want to trigger primarily our sympathetic nervous system. But either way, they want to stimulate, they want to cause a stimulation in one or more of our centers. And in doing so, keep us identified with what we believe to be real. In other words, what we think is real, but it's a simulation. So where is the spirit in all of this, right? Where is spirit? Where is the spirit? Benjamin says, in electrical terms, the I is a symbol for electrical current in amperes, which is derived from the word current intensity. Our ego is like that, which is the current intensity based on outward stimulation. The stimulation is caused, because remember, there is no current out there. The intensity of the current is the sexual force. It's literally the current, because all electromagnetism is in the fourth dimension. That's the same dimension where the prana and kundalini reside. That's where all energy resides. It's the fourth dimension. So the intensity of the stimulation is what determines how identified we are and how attached we are to the particular I that is executing its program to steal our sexual force and to replicate itself, because that's its all mechanical entities. That's what they do. They exploit, proliferate, and dominate. That's what egos do. That's what they do to us as individuals, and that's what they do in macrocosm, in the environment. Where is spirit? And what we described, everything that we showed so far, pleasure and pain, craving and aversion, wanting and not wanting, being in a simulation and being stimulated, and being identified with these statements, I want this and I don't want that. Tiffany says, spirit is watching. Are you observing though? There's an aspect of spirit which is always watching, but are you observing? Because there's an aspect of you that is spirit. But if you're not watching, if you're not paying attention, then that aspect of spirit isn't watching. That aspect of spirit is caught up in. That consciousness is asleep, dreaming, caught up in the simulation, believing that it's real. You could say that this whole process that we've been talking about, that we've been describing and walking through step by step, you could very easily say that this is a process of being despirited. Mugaboo says, isn't this a mechanism put in place for the survival of animals? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And on that level, on the level of animals, on the level of mechanical nature, it's perfectly appropriate. And that's spirit expressing itself on the level of mechanical nature. But we weren't talking about animals. We were talking about human beings, or at the very least, intellectual animals who call themselves human. But remember, we've talked about this before. There's two natures of nature. There's mechanical nature, and then there's divine nature, which we could call spirit. And it's perfectly fine to say all of this is required for mechanical nature, but this is mechanical nature. These are two separate natures, and they're separate and distinct for a reason. And one of them, if we haven't made it clear, one of them is a simulation, and that a consciousness obsessed with it and hypnotized by it can be said to be despirited, because that consciousness forgets its true spirit and instead identifies with its mechanical nature. And without us having to get there, just your questions themselves has gotten us there. This divides us. This separates us. It separates us from our own nature, from our own divine nature, our own spirit. And we are thrown into the wilderness. This is what was allegorized in the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve are cast out of paradise. They're cast out into the wilderness. What is the wilderness? The wilderness is the place of that which is wild. The wilds. Mechanical nature, animal nature. Because animals are wild. So the wilderness is a state of existence for animals. And that's where this humanity was cast out into the world of animals. 3D, quote, reality that we believe and think is real, and all of these cravings and aversions, all this stimulation that is taking place in this simulation, which we believe and think is reality. The ego mind is constantly trying to reinforce our relationship with wild animals and with mechanical nature. And all of nature idolatry comes out of this. The worship of nature, mechanical nature, and that path, unfortunately, leads to devolution. That path ultimately leads to a despirited path.